네, 안녕하세요. 여러분들 잘 들리시는지 모르겠습니다. 한국어로 시작합니다마는 영어로 Please open my course outline. I already emailed and also updated as of today. The reason why I'm calling your attention to this course outline first is to show you that course requirement. That is, for example, you open fourth page of this course outline Word file. There is a grading policy. I know that all of you are very interested in how the course is graded by myself and my TA, Mr. An. Midterm open book online exam will be given 40% weight. Final open book online exam will be equally given 40% weight. And reading, in parentheses, listed under each lecture date, summaries and assignments, if there is any assignment, but mostly in case summaries, that will be given 20% weight. Okay, so reading summaries typically could be 1 page, 2 page, or 3 page, depending on the article you are you are supposed to read. That at the end of that week, you can submit that in free format Word file to my TA, Mr. An, and we will keep the record of your submission of reading summaries as required readings. And also it is helpful because some of the midterm or final exam will probably refer to readings assigned. For example, if you open the course outline, by lecture date, lecture contents, first lecture and second lecture has chapter assignments, chapter 2 and chapter 3. So just chapter 2, chapter 3 reading is enough. No summary is required. For example, moving to lecture 3, February 26, Mason et al. Textbook, chapter 4, reading is enough. No summary is required. Lecture 4, the same. Lecture 4, reading is sufficient. No summary is required. But starting from 5th week, week 5, March 11th, for example, there are 2 required readings. My own article 2000, Pyo 2018. So from 5th week, you are required to read these papers in advance, of course, and submit the summary to my TA, Mr. An, and so forth. So then, for example, in week 6, there are 4 articles. Week 7, there are 2 articles, and so forth, right? So I already mentioned the reading required underneath each week's title, subtitles, okay? That's about it. That's the most important thing to remember for grading purpose. Next, I will start. Okay, so the chapter 2, we begin to study chapter 2. And the reason we are starting from chapter 2 is because chapter 1 is the introduction. And I'm hoping that you have already read chapter 1, because chapter 1 is kind of overview and contents of each chapter is spelled out in chapter 1. So it's a very introduction in Mason's textbook. Okay. Now, Mason's book, Mason and others have written this book. It was published back almost 40 years ago. So like 1980, as I remember. Because 1979, as you will learn, President Park was assassinated. So 1980, the writers are writing in the context that we just had a very terrible, tragic accident, assassination was done to President Park. And therefore, Korean economy after 1979, and at the time of that book writing by American scholars and Korean scholars together, were very uncertain. It was very turbulent period, 1980. But I have chosen always this Mason et al.'s textbook, Modernization in the Republic of Korea, Economic and Social Modernization. The reason is because this textbook covers very important period in Korean economy. Pre-colonial period, briefly, at the same time, colonial period under Japanese imperial intrusion and imperial invasion into Korean Peninsula. So, of course, that was before the Korean Peninsula was divided into North and South from 1945 to 1948. So not many textbooks or not many books in English has covered that colonial period, pre-colonial period, in the context of economic and social modernization. So this textbook itself is very valuable, one. And secondly, the reason why I'm choosing always this as a textbook is because English was used at its very best version. In other words, almost all writers were native English speaker, English professors at Harvard Institute of International Development, Mason and Perkins, and all these people were well-known Korean specialists or Japanese specialists, scholars. So the English you are reading is a good English. I think it is really important. Whenever you read a book, the book should be written by hopefully native English speaker and writer. Thirdly, the reason why I'm choosing this as a textbook for this course is because it carries somehow kind of independent, at the same time balanced historic perspectives. You see, because the period being covered is Japanese colonial period. Therefore, English writers, American writers can carry more objective views because they are neither Koreans nor Japanese. So it's always this colonial period's experience carries very controversial issues. For example, recently, as you know, there were very thorny and controversial issues between Japan and Korea, still existing. One around comfort woman issue. I don't know whether you have heard of it. The other is so-called war compensation against Korean workers forced to work in Japanese mining facilities and other factories. And, Japan claims regular diplomatic sort of channel. Everyone was paid off, but some of the Korean court rules that separate individual claim for war compensation can be still effective and valid. And therefore, there is a still very controversial issues between Japan and Korea. And I'm hoping that this textbook still carries some kind of balanced and at the same time, objective viewpoints. And that's the reason why I have chosen this textbook as a good textbook. The best strategy for all of you students to learn this topic, East Asia comparative advantage, at least for the first half, which deals with the Korean economy, I think reading intensively and extensively around this textbook is the best strategy. And as you know, you and me, we are all second language learner as far as English is concerned, right? So for the second language learner, for the people who are not native English writer or speakers, the best way is to highlight keywords of each sentence or each chapter. So for example, on the slide here, first page, modernization and dualism, which is red marked, are two keywords. The best strategy is to try to memorize, understand these underlined key words to understand that chapter. Okay, so let me begin with modernization. Modernization is defined as the process of change toward those types of social, economic, and political systems developed in Western Europe and North America from roughly 17th to 19th century. Okay, in this case, please pay attention to the word social, economic, and political. So that means society changes, economy changes, and their political systems changes during this process. That's what we call modernization. And particularly, the modernization has something to do with being developed by Western Europe and North America centered. In other words, modernization to some extent is Europeanization or Americanization from the third world perspective. And during the 17th through 19th century. And that kind of movement, modernization phenomena, was spread to other European countries, not only Western Europe, but also Eastern European countries. And in the 19th, 20th century, South American, Asian, and African continents. The third word, in most developing countries, the development can be observed in line with the concept of dualism. What is dualism? Economic structure and growth follows Western trends. On the other hand, whereas political structure and values generally do not follow what? do not follow Western trends, Western standards. So in other words, dualism is kind of a coined word in the sense that on the surface, economic structure and growth follows Western trends. What does that mean? What is Western trends? Western countries, Western Europe and North America, from the period of 17th to 19th century, has experienced rapid economic growth and economic structural transformation from agrarian society toward industrialized society. So structural change means from agricultural society structurally changing into industrial society. That's the structural change. What do we mean by growth? Any modernization cannot be implemented, cannot be conceived if it does not follow upgrading of living standard. In other words, upgrading of per capita income. So economic structural change means from agrarian society toward industrial society. Economic growth means per capita income, steady increase in per capita income. That per capita income growth was vividly observable in Western Europe and North America from 17th to 19th century. So in other words, economic structural change and growth in per capita income follows Western trends. Whereas the third word is suffering from political, structural, and values generally do not follow Western standards, Western trends. Politically, they are still under dictatorship, mostly. Military government is not fully democratic society. And therefore, their political structure is retarded. On the other hand, economic structure and growth follows Western trends. But political structure and values are not following Western trends. That's we call dualism. So the economic growth defined as an increase in per capita income, as I have just said, expansion of modern sector and contraction of the traditional sector. Usually, in this case, modern sector means some factory or at least some cottage manufacturing, in-house manufacturing. That sector is increasing. On the other hand, contraction of the traditional sector means agricultural sector or fishery sector, traditional sector, but being contracted. Urbanization, change in the structure of output and employment, increasing literacy, and the decrease in production for domestic use, industrialization. So if I interpret, increasing literacy is opposite words could be decreasing illiteracy. I may write it here. So decreasing illiteracy means increasing literacy. Literacy, illiteracy are opposite words, right? And the decrease in production for domestic use. So, this is economic growth defined as an increase in not only per capita income, expansion of the modern sector, more manufacturing-based sector, contraction of the traditional sector, fishery or agricultural sector are traditional sector, urbanization, change in the structure of output and employment. How? In the structure of output and employment, increase in manufacturing or service sector, decline of agricultural sector. Increasing literacy, synonymously, we can say that decreasing illiteracy and decrease in production for domestic use. What does that mean? As the economy moves on to economic growth, modernization, domestic production will be limited and domestic demand may be limited. So ultimately, the society, the economy starts to produce for foreigners, foreign export. So export demand is increasing as a result of modernization. And industrialization means fast movement from agriculture to industrial society. Communications, telephone, and all other communication devices, and social mobility. What do we mean by social mobility? As the economy moves almost to classless society, no class society, social mobility means lower social status people can move up to through wealth redistribution or through education system. Lower status social class or social status people can move up to upper social status. We call that movement social mobility. On the other hand, political sphere, little evidence of an expansion of the modern sector, limited to a few political elites. What does that mean? This type of first paragraph, economic growth widely dispersing, communication increasing, social mobility increasing, industrialization. Against these backdrops, on the other side, political sphere, little evidence of an expansion of the modern sector. What does that mean? Little evidence of expansion of democracy. So, political side, a lot of third world countries were still suffering from lack of democracy, limited to a few political elites. So dictatorship, military government, that kind of authoritarian regimes were popular all over the place in the third world. Again, this is the dualism we just defined. Economic growth is very much modern concept. Move towards capital-intensive, market-oriented enterprises. Yes. For example, here I may introduce the concept of for example, Adam Smith David Ricardo, Adam Smith's best description, Wealth of Nations, in his seminal book, Wealth of Nations, is outlining, the capitalism, this kind of Bible over. And this Bible of capitalism emphasizes what? Best emphasis is a division of labor. And another coined word, invisible hands. These are coined words spelled out by famous Adam Smith in his book, Wealth of Nations, which is critically defined, referred to as Bible of Capitalism. And what Adam Smith emphasized is the power of division of labor. In his book, for example, a shoemaker and bread maker, or for example, the guy who makes tools in the cottage factory, for example, each person, when they specialize on their specialties, like baker guy, the person who is well known to make bakery, he just specializes on making bakery. If you have, for example, clothing making design and facility and talents, you just keep making clothing. If you are very specialized in making tools, please make tools. And each person specializing in their talents of the division of labor. Then in the market, they can exchange. So you can exchange for more bread, you can exchange for more tools, you can exchange for more, clothing. And that is governed by invisible hands, not by the government, but not by the arbitrary authority, but by so-called invisible hand. And that's the philosophy of Adam Smith. And David Ricardo followed up. That are Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations in spelling out comparative advantage. Comparative advantage. Okay, so I will give you, I used to teach international trade at Seoul National University, and David Ricardo's comparative advantage. I know this is not really a good space, but this is a very important concept. So let me give you the example of comparative advantage. Okay, so for example, suppose there are two nations, England and Portugal. Suppose two nations are for example, to produce clothing, one unit, England needs 100 people. Portugal needs 80 persons. But to produce wine, England needs 80 persons. Portugal needs, let's say, okay. Okay, so coming back to this classic example of David Ricardo's comparative advantage concept. And we used to call these we call unit labor requirements and 2x2 matrix. In other words, to produce 1 unit of clothing, 1 unit, you need England needs 100 persons, Portugal needs 80 persons. Clothing, wine, 1 unit, England needs 80 persons, Portugal needs 50 persons. Okay. So suppose then what we can demonstrate here is that England has absolute comparative advantage, absolute disadvantage. Over Portugal. Because Portugal is less manpower than England. So absolute disadvantage is the coined word. Okay. On the other hand, I can say Portugal has absolute advantage over England because Portugal needs less manpower than England. Okay. On the other hand, England has comparative advantage over in producing clothing and Portugal has comparative advantage in producing wine. The reason is because in wine producing, they require 50% divided by 80 versus 80 divided by 50. On the other hand, England, clothing to produce clothing 100 people are needed to produce 80 and has comparatively in producing clothing, wine producing versus wine producing, they have 80 divided by 1. So this is the situation. Okay. So the payoff matrix. Suppose this is 1 unit produced. 1 unit each produced. So word total, total is 1 unit, 2 units. So suppose word total is 2 units. Units. Okay, so word total is 2 units. Wine, the same. One unit, 80 persons. If England put one unit, 80 persons, they probably received 1 unit, produced 1 unit, and Portugal, 50 persons, 1 unit. So together, 2 units. Worldwide, 2 units. Now, suppose okay, so this is the setup. Okay. Now, I'm demonstrating. So after complete specialization, division of comparative advantage. suppose England knows they have a specialty, comparative advantage in clothing. So England puts 180 people here. Persons. And on the other hand, Portugal puts everyone, 130 persons here in winemaking. In winemaking. Okay, and here they put 0. Here, zero, 130. Then 180 persons will give you England 1.8 units. Units of clothing. And if you specialize in wine based on their comparative advantage, and 130 persons will give them equal to 50 persons 1 unit, 130 divided by 2.6 units. So word total becomes 1.8 units. 180 persons, 1.8 units. So wine becomes available 2.6 units. The total. Okay. So that means if exchange rate ratio is 1:1, then world total becomes equal to 4.4 units. And world total was 4 units. So this 4.4 units better than so this after complete specialization. So we are demonstrating that it's a very simple numerical example. That is, if each country does not concentrate on comparative advantage, produce 1 unit each clothing and wine, what total becomes 2 units, and what total will be 4 units of clothing and wine. But by any chance, if complete specialization, division of labor, in other words, England concentrate production of clothing and Portugal concentrate on producing wine, over which they have comparative advantage, world total unit becomes increasing to 4.4 units. So this simple numerical example demonstrates how comparative advantage-based trade will increase modernization benefit. Okay. This is what, as I described here, comparative advantage. Okay. So rather than just abstractly knowing that comparative advantage is better than trade based on absolute advantage, you can refer to this little numerical construct assuming clothing 1 unit is produced in England with 100 persons, Portugal 80 persons. For example, in England, wine 1 unit can be produced with 80 persons, Portugal 50 persons. Then we may say that Portugal is absolutely advantageous nation because it requires less number of people in both clothing and wine. Then do we have a world in which Portugal produces clothing and wine only? England producing nothing? No, the real world, England produces something, Portugal produces something. So this numerical example shows you, suppose if England is concentrating comparative advantage just production, clothing. So they have 180% to clothing production. Then probably because as this example, 100 persons is needed to 1 unit, they will end up producing 1.8 units of clothing. Suppose Portugal is concentrated in wine production, comparative advantage of production. So they put Portugal people, 130 people together into wine production, which requires 50 people, 130 persons mobilized to produce 1 unit of wine per 50 people. So that means 2.6 units can be produced. Altogether, worldwide, this means there will be 1.8 unit clothing, 2.6 unit wine. Together, 4.4 units if we assume exchange ratio is 1:1, in other words, equal price per unit of wine is traded to per unit of clothing, then we can say world total becomes 4.4 units. Previously, world total was only 4 units. So the world with comparative advantage is better off. Okay. Okay, so here I complemented here and here, probably here. Why then comparative advantage in England in producing, the clothing? Why England has comparative advantage in clothing? We call opportunity cost concept. To produce 1 unit of clothing, England, opportunity cost is 80 units of wine. But for Portugal, 80 persons over 50. So in other words, opportunity cost of producing clothing is higher in Portugal. So that concept is laid out here. I think I try to lay out. Opportunity cost of clothing in England is 100 versus 80, but opportunity cost of producing clothing in Portugal was 80 versus 50. So these are, if I may write down, these are opportunity costs. Producing clothing. That's what I mean. This concept is important. On the other hand, let us discuss over opportunity cost of producing wine. In Portugal, to produce 1 unit of wine, 50 persons. With respect to 80 persons clothing. But in England, to produce 80 versus 100. So in other words, if you think of here, that becomes Portugal has 50 over 80. On the other hand, England, Portugal has 50 over 80, but England 80 over 100. And 50 over 80 50 over 80 is less than. In other words, what this means is 50 over 80 is less than inequality, less than 80 over divided by 100. Opportunity cost of producing clothing. Right. So in this case, opportunity, what this means is opportunity cost of producing clothing is lower. So 100 divided by 80 is lower than 80 over divided by 50. That's what I mean by it. So in other words, if you come to here, this numerical example, from England point of view, as I said, Portugal has absolute advantage over clothing and wine. Both production, Portugal is much better off nation to produce efficiently because they require less number of people in both clothing and wine production, right? But comparative advantage is different concept. To illustrate comparative advantage, which country has what kind of comparative advantage, you need to mobilize opportunity cost. So go to England. For England, opportunity cost of clothing is 100 persons are required, right? But Portugal, 80 persons required. So 100 versus 80. But in terms of wine, England 80, Portugal 50. In other words, Portugal has very comparative advantage, a lot more in producing wine relatively. Okay, so that's the message, Ricardo message. Then England completely specialized in production of clothing. and wine completely specialized by Portugal, then world total becomes a lot larger than previous no comparative advantage world. Okay. The reason why I inserted this comparative advantage concept, the rest of the material you can read, but this is kind of very core of international trade theory. And I think understanding core theory is more important than anything else. The rest of the thing you can just read through historical or cultural perspective. So even though I may have spent too much time on explaining theory, still at your stage of learning, it's important to try to understand core theory, international trade theory, better than anything else. Okay, so that's why I spent a lot of time. The rest of the material is, as it says, political structure, however, is authoritarian. Power gathers under a few individuals. Rest of the populace remains apathetic and under repression. Dualism between modern sector and traditional sector. According to Pai, constitutional democracy is a Western institution, and it might not be relevant for the new states of Asia and Africa. And we call this as cultural relativism. What do we mean by cultural relativism? Democracy can be a better institution for Western countries, but not necessarily the new states of Asia and Africa. So culturally divided, relatively viewed, according to Pai. In the West, the rise of democratic institutions has been shaped by powerful social forces which intermediate the state and the citizen, but it was absent in most of the third world. The reason is because in the third world, the citizen group is not well developed, well organized. Therefore, there is a chasm, there is a division between powerful elite group at the top and at the bottom, mass. In between, there should be citizen group, but citizen group were not existing in the third world. Autocratic authority of colonial regimes, less autocratic authority of domestic elites, not by a consent of the governed, not by the people's consent, but on the basis of an assumed identity of interest arising out of common nation. So this is a general description of the third world situation. Nationalism is a cement holding many of these societies together and legitimizing existing regimes. For example, in the third world, typically power elite group makes use of nationalism. Okay, under nationalism, we have to protect our interest and so forth. They make use of nationalism as an excuse of avoiding democracy, holding on to dictatorship under nationalism. So any disconsent, any opposition group, they say they are anti-nationalism, not nationalistic movement, they claim. Many military governments are appealing to nationalism. Iran and Korea, under ostensibly civilian control, but strong military influence. Military expenditure growth in LDCs, less developed countries, was bigger than in developed countries. That's the signal of the third word, holding on to nationalism and military power. Since 1965, increase in coercive practices, effective instruments for regime stability continued. So Adam Smith, I already explained. The decision determining the use of resources and distribution of income were made in the marketplace with government holding the ring. After 19th century, the role of government became active. 20th century phenomena is social welfare legislation, trade unions, regulation in business practices. All these modern institutional setup only after 20th century. Okay, what is 20th century? Roughly 1900, year 1900 after. Political democracy in the West grew strong when government played relatively minor role. And therefore, the mixed economies we call public and private sector continues to coexist. So public enterprise controls over private firms, taxation and subsidies, invention in labor management relations, intervention, a guiding role in the use of resources. Of course, modern economy becomes increasingly mixed economies. When the use of resources and distribution of income became political issues, can it stand the strain? Scandinavian countries and the West, unusually rapid growth, more could be given to some groups without taking away from others. So now with slower growth, difficult to maintain democratic procedures. So this is ideally Scandinavian model, but this is okay when the economy grows strong, healthy. This strain is not there, but when the economy slows down, redistribution between the rich group and the poorer group is getting more difficult. Not yet a socialist structure with political democracy. That means we do not see a socialist economy or a socialist structure, nation, with fully political democracy. Not yet. So that's kind of 1980 version. At that point, Western scholars were evaluating. We see a lot of socialist economies, economic structure, nations, but not with full democracy yet. The third word, Western democracy and practices, very different from new states of Latin America, in Asia and Latin America. Requirements, expansion of public enterprise, long-run planning, and so forth. Since 1945, 125 military coups in the third world. New governments suppress potential opposition, different political stability from the Western stability. Authoritarian regime, we call Ghana, Indonesia versus Brazil and Korea and Taiwan, different kinds of authoritarian regime. Democratic governments, Malaysia, Sri Lanka, India, but it's ironic, these democratic governments met with sluggish growth. Those dictatorship, Brazil, Korea, and Taiwan, under somewhat authoritarian regimes, more faster economic growth. On the other hand, these more democratic nations, governments, sluggish growth. So full-fledged democracy is difficult for land reform or changes in land tenure. You cannot change land tenure, land reform. Therefore, your ability to make economic growth is very slowed down, dependent on democratic government. Korea in 1974 quadrupled oil price, but not possible in democracy, but possible under AI. What does that mean? When the oil price increased 4 times, there were no riots, nothing, no demonstration. On the other hand, a lot of democratic societies in Sri Lanka, India, Pakistan, Thailand, massive demonstration because they could not afford 4 quadrupled oil price. But in Korea, because it was under AR, authoritarian regime, not full democracy, no demonstration was staged and passed over 1974 oil crisis. So authoritarian regimes adorn themselves with terms such as guided democracy, disciplined democracy, people's democracy. For example, look at current China. Is China full democracy? No. Some people call Chinese economy democracy as guided democracy, disciplined democracy, or people's democracy. But these are adorn themselves, authoritarian regimes. No freedom of organization and propaganda, no peaceful transfer of power existing in many authoritarian regimes. 10th, an economic history of modern China. I will be very brief because we will go to China section very quickly. The traditional Chinese economy outperformed the European economies. At the onset of 14th century, Europe started to precede, grow faster through medieval industrial revolution. From 18th century to 14th century, per capita income remained stagnant, overthrew population, and GDP continued to grow and remained the largest in the world. By 1950, the relative decline is so great that China's per capita income is about 1/10 of European counterparts. And we will, of course, learn these in detail in China economy section. What happened to China between 1950 and 1978? I don't have to recall that this Chinese has achieved very remarkable economic progress. China in the last 200 years, part 1, China's pre-modern growth economy. Why not industrial revolution in 14th century China? Why 18th century England's industrial revolution is mystery. But we will learn these when we get into Chinese economy. On economic history of modern China, of course, we will get into this toward the end of maybe within next 3 or 4 weeks. On economic history of modern China, why Japan, not China? First non-European country to industrial successfully. Both had a very low initial per capita income. Both had agrarian economies with high mainland ratio, intensive farming method, the same irrigation technology, but Chinese society relatively more advanced, essentially a capitalist society with free peasantry and private property rights, relatively high inter and intra-class mobility, with an incentive system based on achievement and individual merit. So initial condition was in China was better than in Japan. What happened? Japan and rather than China swift and smooth transition to modern economic growth after Meiji restoration. We will learn this when we get into the Japanese section. China's transition, but slow and painful. It started from Opium War in 1942, but it was not until 1949. In communist China taking over, hence China's transition lasted for more than 100 years. During this process, Japan started to jump, move forward through Meiji restoration, and exceeded Chinese development. So this is a kind of modern Japan's section. We will learn modern Japanese section. All these, for example, this is a comparison of per capita GDP, for example, around 19. If you look at this, Japan, Taiwan, Korea, and China, it was around 1930, 1920 period per capita income estimates. Modern China, again, we will get into Chinese economic history. Continues to cultural revolution, more modern stuff after Mao's Great Leap Forward movement. Is more modern Chinese economic history. And Mao's with Zhou Enlai picture. And this is Tsinghua University meltdown by demonstrators during the Cultural Revolution, which shows you that modern China was inevitably with chaos, Cultural Revolution. And modern China's economic history, we will continue to learn. And Korea after 1945. And Mr. An, I will begin next class with this slide, okay? Remind me. Okay, I will stop here for next session. We will start Korea after 1945, this chapter. Again, because of my introduction to somewhat heavy trade theory, but I think that understanding is very crucial for you to understand this kind of international comparison, comparative advantage. These are so fundamental economic concepts. I'm hoping that I could sort of step in and insert core trade theory part so that you can better understand the theory of comparative advantage. Because that theory of comparative advantage is repeatedly referred to in this text. Okay. I usually conduct about 10-minute break. Today, it was kind of heavy. I could not afford having a break, tea time for 10 minutes, but I hope from next week class, I will be open to your more questions and more time for quick break, like 10 minutes, okay? Please address any questions. chat message 딱 통했지? 응? Okay. Are there any questions or comments you'd like to address right now rather than waiting for email communication? Please do not hesitate.
No, not any questions. Thanks you for the lecture.
Okay, Min Marina, your name? Please identify your name. Burakov?
Vladimir.
Vladimir. Okay, welcome, Vladimir.
Thanks you for the lecture.
Yes. Any comments or any questions?
No, I'll understand.
We haven't a question. Thank you for your lecture. This is very interesting.
Okay. Thank you very much for your comments. Vladimir, what is your major? In other words, what is your specialty, special area of interest?
I'm studying in the Irkutsk, Irkutsk National University, and I study at
ISU.
I'm I'm learning at politology. It's politology of Irkutsk Oblast directly. Yeah.
So you are specializing in political,
political science, yes.
Political science.
For sure.
Very nice. Very nice.
And very interested in the Latin American region.
Right. Okay. Very nice.
And South America.
You see, Vladimir, you know, even if we may say America, Latin America is very different from North America. Do you know that?
Not North America, South America.
Yeah, South America. Yeah. So Latin America, South America has very different political landscape and economic landscape. Okay. That will be very interesting area for you to study about.
Yeah, I think so.
Anyone else? Are we connected, Professor Evgenia? Professor Evgenia, are you missing? I think Professor Evgenia is missing today. Professor Park? Okay. Okay, then everyone, I hope to see you next week, next Monday. Until then, please read textbook intensively. Thank you for your all attention. Thank you. 나가지 뭐.